Okay, we're recording again. It says I'm screen sharing, but it does not appear to be doing that.
Now you've got some strange screen with an unhappy piece of paper on it.
Of course he's unhappy. Okay.
Let's see.
Sorry, y'all. Share. Oh, wow. Okay.
Maybe pull that one down and start over.
Hope, which of the files on the invitations is the one that you're going to show?
I was putting a link to it in our webinar chat, but I need someone else to put it in the public chat. So, because I don't have the permissions to be able to put that. And it looks like we're probably not going to be able to share. Let me see if I have better luck on my side.
And Zahi and members of the public, it's on the page. It's on our web page, the presentation. Under meeting materials, it says presentation PDFs and exploring alternatives to complete prohibition of centralized produced water facilities and DI communities. And so it's easily
Yeah.
there as well.
Okay, I think I'm just going to start, and whenever the tech will catch up with me. And so the presentation and the speaker's notes are on our webpage. So hopefully the public and members of the consortium can follow along. So the title of the presentation is Exploring Alternatives to a Complete Prohibition of Centralized Produced Water Facilities in DI Communities. And this presentation is an update on the consortium's work to explore alternatives to a complete prohibition of centralized produced water facilities in disproportionately impacted communities, resulting in recommendations to ECMC for enhanced protections in DI communities. If you're following along, I'm moving to the next slide. And before I begin, I would like to remind consortium members and the public of what the consortium can and cannot do. The consortium is intended to be an informational resource for the commission and the public, and is not intended to be a party participant in any commission rulemaking proceedings. And this is stated in House Bill 23-1242 as the consortium's role. It's important to note that the consortium has no rulemaking responsibilities. They cannot draft rules, regulations, or legislation. The role of the consortium is to provide recommendations to state agencies that capture the diverse perspectives of all its members, including regulatory, research, environmental NGOs, oil and gas, local government, produced water experts, and NGO disproportionately impacted communities. Next slide. For this presentation, I hope to set the stage for the remainder of the consortium's discussion on alternatives to a complete prohibition of centralized produced water treatment storage facilities in disproportionately or DI communities. I'll start by reviewing a few items that the consortium asked for clarification on at its August 8th meeting. Next, I will review the current proposal for our recommendation, which includes two alternatives to a complete prohibition. The first proposed alternative for ECMC's consideration is that DI communities located within severe ozone non-attainment areas maintain the existing prohibition on centralized produced water facilities. The second proposed alternative for ECMC's consideration is for ECMC to explore allowing the siting of centralized produced water treatment facilities within other DI communities statewide, subject to enhanced protective measures that build on existing measures, and they are related to proximity and site selection, storage and emissions control, transportation and pipeline infrastructure, enhanced community engagement, and coordination with federal, state, and local governments. Finally, due to the scope of our recommendations, I will review additional considerations that the consortium would like ECMC to consider. Next slide. Let's begin with a review and hopefully improve understanding of what the consortium has been asked to do. For the members of the public who may not know about the consortium's past work and how it was created, the consortium was created with House Bill 23-1242 and has 31 appointed members representing diverse perspectives. Members are appointed to represent state and federal agencies, research institutions, environmental groups, industry, produced water experts, local governments, environmental justice groups, and disproportionately impacted communities. Members are appointed to represent these specific perspectives. Consortium staff are directed to include all of the voices of the members in their work products. Important to note, consortium staff are not members of the consortium. The consortium's primary goal is to reduce the use of fresh water and increase the recycling of produced water in oil and gas operations. In September 2024, the consortium made recommendations for a timeline and target for increasing the use of recycled produced water, recognizing centralized produced water treatment and storage was needed to achieve higher levels of recycling of 20% and 35%. These minimum requirements begin in January next year, and the consortium will review the timeline and targets annually beginning in April of next year. The annual review is required by statute. Next slide. Included in the statement of basis and purpose for the produced water rules that ECMC ECMC held a rulemaking for, the Commission recognized that there were many barriers to reuse and recycling of produced water that have been identified in the consortium's past reports. And ECMC asked that the consortium continue to work through these barriers and develop pragmatic recommendations for solutions as their work continues. These issues are listed on the screen and include storage and transportation, legal and liability issues, fit for use classifications, data improvement, including public transparency and data verification, testing standards, community and environmental justice concerns, research gaps, and water sharing agreements, amongst others. The Commission asked the consortium to continue to collect, refine, and analyze basin-specific data to inform conversations around basin-specific considerations and targets that would result in recommendations to ECMC for a future rulemaking on the topic. I wanted to use this time to remind the consortium members and members of the public of this future work as a preview of the recommendations still to come. The recommendation we are working to finalize today is quite narrow in scope, and I will talk about that next. In the statement of basis and purpose for the 2024-2025 produced water rulemaking, the commissioners acknowledged that a complete prohibition of centralized E&P waste management facilities within DI communities may create unintended adverse consequences, and requested the consortium to explore alternatives to a complete prohibition, which would also advance the goals of House Bill 23-1242, which include reducing the use of fresh water and increasing the use of recycled produced water. The commission requested the consortium report back to the commission by September 1st, 2025. During the hearing, the commission informed the parties that this recommendation may serve as a basis for future legislation or rulemaking regarding this issue. The commission also expressed a need for the General Assembly to review the statutory language regarding DI communities and explore legislative changes that address the views of the parties regarding unintended adverse consequences of the current prohibition in DI communities. In addition to the work of the consortium at its May, June, July, and August 8th meetings, consortium members directed staff to investigate the scope of a complete prohibition. Next slide. The alternatives that we are working to finalize today are rooted in the statutory requirement for ECMC to adopt rules that contain a prohibition against the placement of new centralized produced water storage and treatment facilities in DI communities. The legislative mandate resulted in ECMC Rule 907B5H. As a reminder, ECMC Rule 907B5H cannot be modified without a change in statute. I also want to acknowledge that House Bill 23-1242 required operators to report vehicle miles traveled in relation to water usage for each oil and gas location, among other things, which are outside the scope of the request of the consortium to explore alternatives to a complete prohibition. Next slide. In short, a new permanent standalone centralized facility operated for the storage or treatment of produced water cannot be permitted in a DI community with some exceptions. Commercial disposal facilities regulated by CDPHE, multi-well pits that meet the current standards of ECMC Rules 909G2 and 909G3. Temporary on-site produced water or storage treatment facilities for recycling or reuse of produced water at that well site or nearby well sites. Temporary pits under ECMC Rule 909 pits, construction and operation, and standalone UIC, which is underground injection control wells. These exceptions are outside of the request that ECMC made of the consortium and at times are outside of the jurisdictional authority of ECMC. Next slide. The current proposal was developed at the consortium's August 8th meeting. The consortium reached consensus on most items. Next slide. At the consortium's meeting on August 8th, the consortium continued their exploration of alternatives to a complete prohibition of centralized produced water treatment and storage facilities in DI communities. The alternatives that the consortium identified earlier this month are designed to advance the goals of House Bill 23-1242 by encouraging the use of recycled produced water in a manner that reduces the use of freshwater in oil and gas activities and provides enhanced protections for DI communities. The approach taken was to capture all perspectives and broadly address issues. This approach was based on a comprehensive regulatory analysis, and I want to emphasize a specific data analysis was not conducted. The alternatives intentionally avoid prescriptive recommendations until these recommendations can be data-informed and science-based. The recommendations encourage a precautionary approach. The first proposal that was presented and agreed upon at the August 8th meeting for ECMC's consideration is, as an alternative to a complete prohibition, the consortium recommends that the complete prohibition on centralized produced water treatment facilities remain in place for DI communities located within severe ozone non-attainment areas. The justification is that the complete prohibition is the most protective for these DI communities. The map on this slide shows a red outline representing the boundary of the ozone non-attainment area, and the non-light green colored blocks indicate DI communities. From my perspective, that's kind of the purple ones and the dark green and some of the hatch marked communities. Next slide. Counties within the severe ozone non-attainment areas, and not all of those counties are DI communities. The DI communities in the severe ozone non-attainment areas are a little more smaller. But these counties include Adams, Arapahoe, Boulder, Broomfield, Denver, Douglas, Jefferson, Larimer, and Weld counties. Some of the communities in the severe ozone non-attainment area are Arvada, Aurora, Boulder, Brighton, Broomfield, Castle Rock, Centennial, Commerce City, Denver, Inglewood, Estes Park, Evergreen, Fort Collins, Golden, Greeley, Highlands Ranch, Lakewood, Littleton, Lone Tree, Longmont, Louisville, Loveland, North Glen, Parker, Superior, Thornton, Westminster, and Windsor. The second proposal that was presented and mostly agreed upon at the August 8th meeting for ECMC's consideration is on the screen. As an alternative to a complete prohibition statewide, the consortium recommends exploring the allowance and siting of centralized produced water treatment facility within other DI communities statewide, subject to enhanced protective measures related to proximity and site selection, storage and emissions control, transportation and pipeline infrastructure, enhanced community engagement, coordination with federal and local governments. We discussed and agreed upon the last 4 of these 5 enhanced protective measures. And I want to thank all of the individual consortium members that helped refine language for the updates made to the report or the letter. At the August meeting, we started the discussion on coordination with federal and local governments, which was in the list of core issues listed last. And this core issue was identified by consortium members. The consortium added to the list state agency coordination. The current list was local and federal, so now it's local, federal, and state coordination. At the August meeting, the consortium added enhanced efforts to improve public trust and renewed focus on safety to early and continuous engagement and transparency and information sharing under the enhanced community engagement recommendation. Next slide. At the August meeting, the consortium added integrating advanced technology and innovation and increased data collection to the prioritization of pipeline infrastructure and enhanced pipeline safety under the transportation pipeline infrastructure recommendation. At the August meeting, the consortium discussed and refined the considerations under the storage and emissions control section. This section includes details on mandatory enhanced emissions capture and control, enhanced treatment of produced water prior to open air storage, pre and post construction monitoring, and life cycle analysis. At the August 8th meeting, consortium members began the conversation on proximity and site selection within DI communities. the discussion reviewed the current protections for DI communities at both ECMC and CDPHE. There was general agreement on including a consideration to fully apply the current rules and regulations and then add enhanced protections for DI communities to fill in those regulatory gaps. There was general agreement upon requiring an alternative location analysis that considers environmental and social factors and utilizing GIS tools for visual understanding. Where we left off and the focus of today's discussion will be on the increased and bright line setbacks that are larger than stated in current rules. The increased setback requirements would be designed to discourage or disallow siting in densely populated areas. These setbacks, as the consortium discussed, should be predetermined, science and evidence-based, and most importantly, employ the precautionary principle as a strategy to avoid or minimize potential risks, particularly when dealing with serious or irreversible risks. Proximity should complement design controls, emission monitoring, and alternative location analysis. The conversation on August 8th also highlighted additional considerations that went beyond the scope of the request from ECMC to explore alternatives to a complete prohibition, which also advances the goals of House Bill 23-1242. These additional considerations are included to reinforce that in all of the consortium's work, the protection of public health, safety and welfare, and the protection and preservation of the environment and the wildlife that makes Colorado a great place to live, recreate, and visit was in the forefront. There is an understanding among consortium members to present recommendations where the benefits of reuse and recycling of produced water is balanced with the potential risks. In addition to the recommendations in the letter, the consortium asked the Commission to consider the following additional considerations and potential barriers to the increased use of recycled produced water. First, in the list is recognized data limitations, including reliance on estimates, small data sets, and lack of interconnectivity between databases managed by different regulatory entities, and work towards improving access to data from multiple agencies in a user-friendly format. The next one is address research gaps associated with the increased use of recycled produced water, including gaps in addressing emissions from produced water treatment and storage, and in the treatment of produced water. Continuing with the additional considerations and potential barriers to the increased use of recycled produced water are to review the infrastructure, storage, treatment, produced water availability, and water sharing agreements used using newly reported data. And just to kind of give some background on that, the consortium has produced many reports in 2024 related to these topics. And with the produced water rules in April 30th of this year, there is additional data that was unavailable in 2024. The final additional consideration is to identify constituents of concerns in produced water, understanding the efficacy of produced water treatment, and determining the appropriate classification of different levels of treated or processed produced water. And that consideration is really related to the consortium's July 1st of this year report on research gaps in understanding produced water a little better. So I have 3 key takeaways from this discussion. The consortium was asked to explore and identify alternatives to a complete prohibition, which we have mostly completed. The consortium developed 2 alternatives and updated the language associated with these alternatives with the exception of the enhanced protection offered by proximity and site selection, which will be discussed today. Additional considerations were added when the consideration was considered outside the scope of ECMC's request of the consortium. Before I ask for questions and hand the floor over to Chair Messner, I want to recognize that several consortium members have contacted me about another alternative to consider adding to our letter to ECMC. Commissioner Messner.
Thanks, Director Dalton. Great overview of the work that we've done up to date. And it has been a lot of work. I mean, I think back to when we were initially asked to do this, and the groundwork that we laid in trying to prepare ourselves for the decision-making process and the development of the recommendations and the amount of time that we've put into this. It's been exceptional, and appreciate everyone's work and dedication to thinking hard about this. I don't know as people really understand the amount of work and that we've done to try to set the stage and better understand this topic and try to come up with the recommendations that we'll ultimately come up with. And you know, again, we're not decision makers, and I think that's a strength. You know, there are decision-making entities out there that may take our recommendation and ultimately do what they want with it. And there'll be different folks outside and inside the consortium that may work and lobby the different entities that are decision makers to further individual perspectives. But we have an opportunity to really set the stage and guide decision makers in things that are really important to us that be considered in ultimate decision making processes. And that's based on our expertise, our knowledge, and the communication and collaboration that we've done on this topic. And so that to me is a really important piece. And I think the other important piece is that we were asked a very specific question. And that specific question, you know, Hope, I think, did a very good job lining out. And I think we have to be very careful that in our work, we're answering that question and not providing stuff that's outside of the scope of the question that we've been asked to discuss here. And so alternatives to a blanket prohibition of centralized produced water treatment facilities in disproportionately impacted communities is really the question that we've been asked. And that, you know, we're going to get asked a lot of different questions as we continue as a consortium. And I want us to be very careful that when we're asked questions to work on, that we're not creating our own questions or going down rabbit holes and you know, looking at other things. I mean, we all want to do that. I think that all makes sense, but we're going to be asked specific questions to work on. And I think we need to be forthright in working on answering those questions that we're asked to work on. And so, so we have a draft recommendation before us. There's some things that Hope has highlighted for additional work. Certainly all perspectives and views and ideas, you know, are welcome as part of the consortium. And so certainly interested in different thoughts that folks might have as we continue this conversation today. And, you know, ultimately, as I indicated with my opening comments, you know, my goal would be for us to find a way to consensus, because there is a power in consensus in being able to set the stage and guide future decisions on this topic. The other option that we have is to capture disparate voices of the consortium members and provide that as part of a recommendation. I think that has less power to it and allows whatever decision makers in the future to pick and choose what they like and what they don't like, versus the power of the collective voices of everyone in one you know, in one recommendation. And so we'll see where we get and looking forward to the conversation. So Hope, how do you want to handle this? Do you want to facilitate it? Do you want me to call on people? How are you envisioning this?
I think because you have a role on the commission, I would like to facilitate the conversation.
Yep.
And with that, Barbara Vasquez has, I would like to start with Barbara Vasquez in the discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Hope. Michael has a question, I think.
Michael, do you mind waiting until after Barbara?
Not a problem. I just had a question about clarification on the two alternatives, but I'm happy to wait until after Barbara talks.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So I would invite us to think as though we're a member of a disproportionately impacted community for the start of my comments. It is straightforward to say, don't penetrate the DICs. We have this protection. Don't mess with it. It's going to protect these disproportionately impacted communities. And there are a few reasons why that may not be as strong a protection or may even be a hollow promise. And the one thing we have not talked about yet in the preamble to this discussion is that DIC boundaries are not permanent. They change with census data. So you can imagine a situation where someone who lives in a DIC is told that they're protected from impacts of produced water storage and treatment, only to have the DIC that they live in be removed because of new census data or a new one created. So it is not a given that that is a permanent protection. Furthermore, as Hope outlined and has been outlined in the documents we've reviewed, there are other ways to create a produced water treatment facility in a DIC that are not prohibited by 1242. So as an advocate for a DIC, you tell people that they're protected. A, the DIC is not permanent. B, there are types of produced water treatment and storage facilities that aren't covered by ECMC regulation and 1242. So with that, ask the question of yourself, what is the best protection we could offer, not only to members of DICs, but to individuals who live anywhere in the state? And that is something based on proximity. And I hope that we can seriously consider this proximity idea as a solution. But as a member of a West Slope organization and their representative to this commission, I'm sorry, consortium, we're not a commission. Sorry, John. I have to say we have always advocated for consistent rules across the state. The West Slope is not different than the Front Range in terms of the individuals hoping to have clean air and clean water. So with that, I'd also like us to consider a consistent approach that works statewide. It gives regulatory certainty for industry. It gives a consistent understanding of protections to all the individuals who live in our state. And for that reason, I encourage us to think about a solution that would be uniform and easy to understand by all parties. And thank you, Hope, for letting me throw that in, whether this ends up consensus or not. I'd like to have it captured in our additional considerations. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. And we had a question from Michael. Michael?
Thanks. So I had really just two questions in the nature of clarification of the alternatives you described that are on the table. As I understood your presentation and the draft letter, the two alternatives we've been talking about were one that maintained the DIC prohibition for the Front Range counties, and the second alternative that set a set of enhanced protections in 5 categories, I think, proximity, emissions, and so on, statewide. I was hoping to get maybe a little bit, get more clear in my head about how the two relate to each other. My understanding when we met earlier this month was that if we went with the first alternative that included a DIC prohibition just in the Front Range, the rest of the state would be subject to those enhanced protections. So it wouldn't be like we have a prohibition on the Front Range and nothing else for DICs elsewhere in the state. It would be those enhanced protections would apply wherever the prohibition wasn't enforced. Is that your understanding of the proposal?
Correct. And I am willing to work on the language so that it's more clear. But essentially, from my perspective, what I was trying to communicate is the enhanced protections would apply statewide, except in the ozone non-attainment areas. And I also thought that what applied statewide, not specifically to Front Range communities, because the non-attainment ozone is statewide, but it just happens to be that the Front Range communities, probably with their increased populations and industry and cars, etc., that's where the non-attainment areas are. So I am obviously not communicating that well, and so I wanted to work on that language.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. And I think it would be important, as I think I hear you describing, that those enhanced protections would apply statewide, in part for areas other than the Front Range, but also the current draft of the letter provides that even in the Front Range where that prohibition would be included, the recommendation letter also provides for ECMC to allow for exceptions there based on where there's other alternative, where I think they conclude that the impact would be greater than enforcing the prohibition, which I think would be a substantial change from the statute. And I think it would be really important if we do make a recommendation like that, that you still have the backstop of the enhanced protections everywhere in the state, including the Front Range, if exceptions are granted.
Thank you. I think, Kevin, you're next.
Thank you, Hope. Kevin Chan, representing DIC and communities of color. I honestly have had such a very hard time with this assignment from the ECMC, mainly because one, I think it conflicts with the original 23/1242. It explicitly stated that there was a prohibition on DIC, but the ECMC has asked us to ask for alternatives and research alternatives. We don't make we don't make the law, but the lawmakers told us that this was explicitly what they were looking for. I would feel more comfortable if this went back to the lawmakers for revision and they said, hey, like if we're looking for alternatives. It just feels conflicting to me. It feels like that a lot of this was kind of rushed through, especially with the last ECMC meeting that approved some of these. I do have a lot of issues. That's one point, and then I kind of lost track of the second point that I was kind of forming, but I just want to highlight that perhaps we do state that in our letter that this although it was asked of us to consider the prohibition. I just don't feel that we've done that by entertaining this request from the ECMC. I do want more recycling, but I mean, there's also ways to kind of reduce freshwater usage. It's just that this consortium has been tasked with, the waste effects of it, but we need to consider the holistic picture of, this operation as a whole, and not really pigeonhole ourselves into, hey, this is what we were asked, but then they're both conflicting issues. That's all I have.
Thank you for articulating the conflict. I'm sure we'll come back to that topic. Emma, Commissioner Pinter, you were next.
Yep, Emma is also my name, so thanks, Hope. I had a couple of questions as follow-up. I really appreciate, and to gesture just sort of broadly, the generalized anxiety that I've heard from the previous speakers about the choices before us. Kevin, I particularly agree, representing Adams County, which is frequently a disproportionately impacted community. 70% of my residents live in a disproportionately impacted community. I think the problem that I see with switching out of the formula from the legislative intent to something like a standard setback is I feel like that removes the, and I hate using this phrase because it means like so many things, but the cumulative impact that happens in disproportionately impacted communities. And when you have a standard setback, there isn't a secondary calculus for like how many such impacts are cohabitating in one facility. And just feeling, I don't have an outcome or a recommendation at this time, but just want to echo my ongoing concern that we're straying from the legislative intent that was hard fought, as well as there's a reason why these communities are disproportionately impacted. We treat it like a phrase, but it's actually a state of being. And I think we need to find a way to acknowledge that state of being with more safe protections. And I look forward to a good conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner Pinter. Who was next? I think Jolie.
Thank you, Director Dalton, Jolie Bronner, Environmental Justice seat. Echoing what came before me, I don't need to reiterate the points. Appreciate that we had an assignment. We had an assignment, we looked at it, we tried to unpack it. Hope, is there any way that in our recommendations or in our letter that we can express this, this disconnect? We've had it in every meeting. We've been like, not every meeting, but we have this push and pull where some of us feel concerned about the legislative ask. Some of us want to do the assignment, give the data so we can try to protect communities and have the best for all of us. Workers deserve protections, communities deserve protections, the environment deserves the protections. Is there a way that we can say how complicated this conversation was for us? I mean, we are a recommending body. We're not going to make rules, we're not passing legislation, but we need to share what we hear, how our conversations are hard, and what community has told us. Once again, every community representative has come to talk with their public comment, urging us not to do this. And I fully appreciate that there are needs and industry and jobs and economics on the line, but maybe there's a way that we can include that somehow the education or somehow the transparency is not getting to these DICs. They are not getting this information when we're like, oh, well, this is safe, or we can do this or this setback. And so maybe there's a way that we can include a note about this, of even just something more substantial to say, this was the content of the community comments, not just the increased participation, which I loved. I think the addition was great, Hope. I really liked the community outreach pieces we put in. I love the mention of that that alert line on the western slope that they told us about. Love that, love all these things, but maybe there's a way that we can bridge this seeming gap that we're having right now, where we have two sets of information. And I think we should say that when we give our recommendation and say, there's been some disparity and we're not going to edit what you get. We're going to tell you kind of a little bit of both of these sides, and it was hard to make these recommendations. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jolie. And what I'm hearing is add a section on legislative intent, which I think would probably be more than just a paragraph, but really looking into the legislative intent versus the ask of ECMC. And then I'm also hearing to add a section on the content of public comment. In the chat is a link to the key themes document that was prepared at our July meeting. And that is probably a start of this section on the content of public comment. Would you agree that adding those two sections would address your approach?
Yes, actually. Thank you for outlining that so clearly for me, Hope. And thanks for resharing that document. I'll take a look at that and dive in. And if I have some notes or feedback, we can definitely start there as well, because no need to reinvent the wheel if you guys have already done some writing. So I'll take a look at that and we can just add to it and build from there. Thank you.
That would be awesome. Thank you, Julie. Tessa, I have you next.
Thank you, Hope. Tessa Sorensen, governing body member for the consortium on behalf of CDPHE. I think I want to kind of second Jolie's comments about doing that, because I think that the point of this recommendation and advisory letter to ECMC and these results is to provide uninformed consensus, and if there is not a clear consensus, to provide an informed summary of what the consensuses are on this. It is important to remember, I think, for all of us as members of the consortium, that this is meant to provide extra context, information, and detail and advice to ECMC to allow them to make an informed decision, which could be any number of actions, which may be changes to their regulations, which may not be, which may be them exploring interactions with legislators, which may not be. There are many options available to them. And we cannot assume that whatever is in this recommendation letter will be done or not done. But we can do the best we can to give the most informed advice possible. And I do like the idea of, if there are two consensi, I am not actually sure what the plural is of that, but I think it's consensuses, that we will actually inform ECMC of those. That's it for me.
Thank you, Tessa. Harmony?
Many of you might not know this, but in working with the legislation, and a group called the Colorado Thrives Coalition came out in support of this legislation. They pick one bill out of the 600 ran each year. I believe Irene was part of that. Ramesh, who spoke earlier, was part of it. And the Colorado Thrives Coalition included the Sierra Club, 350 Colorado, labor unions, faith groups, Together Colorado, Cultivando, and organizations statewide, because they had a passion for protecting the waters and protecting the workers and protecting communities. Again, out of 600, oh God, stop calling me. Out of the 600 bills, they picked this one, and this was one of their probably the most important thing to them. So again, in that conversation about legislative intent, I would like that to be included. Since our last meeting, I have spoken with 20 different environmental community organizations statewide about this topic, and they all are very sad, frustrated, disappointed, and scared with what is happening in this conversation and what is happening to their communities. In addition, in person, I met with 3 different industry perspectives to try to have a well-rounded approach to what we're doing here. But again, I think that it's really important when we talk in our recommendations, when we're talking about engagement and when we're talking about community, that there is a very distinct divide between community engagement and industry perspective engagement. They are very different in what they are looking for, what they're asked for, and I ask that we not muddle those together. And I think for me, and also what I heard most often talking to this group, is the frustration that these recommendations are not based in data because we simply don't have it. That this could not be an informed decision, whatever decision is made. And again, frustrations on my own personal end and frustrations from many of these groups that we can't access the data, it's hard to get to, and that we reach out to the commission on a regular basis and our requests go completely ignored and unanswered. As we move forward with this, if we move this protection, we stare at improved engagement, but engagement to date is frustrating and flawed. So adding more frustrating and flawed engagement feels like an insult to community.
Thank you, Harmony. And I misunderstood the name of the coalition, so I'll reach out to you about that. Commissioner Messner, are you speaking as chair or?
No, I have a couple thoughts, and so
Okay.
I'm raising my hand.
Thank you, John.
I think we're making a couple of blanket assumptions here that I'm not sure are accurate. I think we're making an assumption that a blanket prohibition of centralized produced water treatment facilities in disproportionately impacted communities is protective. And I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that in many situations around the state, by not allowing the centralized produced water treatment facilities in disproportionately impacted communities with the enhanced protections that we're talking about, you're actually directing these facilities into areas that actually may have more sensitive receptors, may have more population density, would not have the emissions controls that we're talking about with these recommendations. Certainly has the potential to increase the truck traffic and the dangers associated with truck transportation of produced water. And so just because these are not going to be allowed in disproportionately impacted communities based on this legislation doesn't mean that the facilities won't get built. And so if the facilities are going to get built on the Western Slope, what parts of the Western Slope are not disproportionately impacted communities? Well, as you look at the maps, those areas are the ones that are actually closest to population centers, believe it or not. They're closer to wetlands areas. They're closer to areas that may have more sensitive receptors. And the amount of impact associated with being able to develop the infrastructure to be able to get it to where the actual facilities are, the oil and gas facilities, is significant, potentially significantly more impactful than having these enhanced protections inside of disproportionately impacted communities, or having these facilities inside disproportionately impacted communities with the enhanced protections. I think the same goes with disproportionately impacted communities on the Front Range. You could cite one of these disproportionately impacted communities on the Front Range are compact, which means you could cite these just outside of a disproportionately impacted community and send all of the trucks through the disproportionately impacted communities, not have the emissions controls that we're talking about here, and still have the issues associated with the centralized produced water treatment facility 350 feet away from the border of a disproportionately impacted community, or 2,000 feet away from the borders of a disproportionately impacted community. And so this assumption that not allowing these facilities inside of disproportionately impacted communities is protective, I think is a little bit flawed. I think we're also making an assumption that the lobbyists and legislators that determined this was necessary in this legislation did the work and analysis that determined that there was no adverse impacts associated with not having these inside of disproportionately impacted communities. And with my experience with the legislature and the legislative process, that level of analysis, expertise, and the level of data actually utilized to make decisions in the legislative process is certainly not the level that we're utilizing here as we're evaluating, these items. And so as we go through this, I want to make sure that we're not making blanket assumptions one way or the other, that allowing it inside disproportionately impacted communities is not protective, or that having it outside of disproportionately impacted communities is not impactful. And so those are just some important thoughts from me that I'm thinking about as I approach this. And I think that there is something to be said for having a recommendation that really emphasizes these enhanced protections that we're talking about, particularly around proximity, around emissions control, and around how produced water is getting transported and stored. And so these are important elements to me, and I think have the opportunity to create a more protective situation inside a disproportionately impacted community than not. But just a couple of thoughts there.
Thank you, Chair Messner. And what I'm hearing is we might need to either add a section or beef up kind of the section on maybe how the complete prohibition might have these unintended consequences, which we really haven't discussed in detail, the unintended consequences. Am I capturing that correctly?
Yes and no. I think I think yes. I think there's some potential unintended consequences with a blanket prohibition, right? And I think I also want to challenge the assumptions that a blanket prohibition is protective, right? And so in some situations, I think it may be protective, but in other situations, I'm not sure that it is protective. And so I think right now we have a recommendation in front of us that maintains that blanket prohibition inside of disproportionately impacted communities in the severe ozone non-attainment area on the Front Range. I think that's a realistic approach and one that I'm not uncomfortable with. And in the rest of the state, it would allow for siting of this centralized produced water treatment facilities in disproportionately impacted communities, but would require that emissions get controlled at an enhanced level than what is currently required, that there would be significant bright line setbacks that utilize the precautionary principle, that prioritize pipeline infrastructure for transporting produced water, enhanced requirements for storage and pipeline safety and community outreach and coordination with local, federal, and state agencies. These are, to me, are really good things. What the maintaining of the blanket, and so in the rest of the state within disproportionately impacted communities, they would gain this benefit, right? Which may be more protective than a blanket prohibition for the reasons I've stated before. Now, these disproportionately impacted communities in the Front Range and the Denver severe non-attainment area wouldn't gain the benefits of these enhanced protections necessarily, right? And so, like I said, they could be sited just outside of these disproportionately impacted communities, utilizing the existing rules that wouldn't have this enhanced bright line setback requirements, the emissions control, the pipelines, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm not sure that anything necessarily needs to get captured. I just, as we're talking about this, I want us to think about that a little bit. Because I just think that's important. And so I'm not sure I helped you at all.
I think so. I think you're more talking about the discussion instead of the document. Rick, you're next.
You're muted, Rick.
Well, that's embarrassing. Thank you, Director Dalton. Rick McCurdy, I sat in one of the seats for experience and expertise in produced water. Wanted to follow up on Chair Messner's comments, and that's one of the things that I'd noted early on is while there are certain exceptions to the prohibition, some of those exceptions, the temporary pits, for example, the temporary treatment facilities, may not allow industry to effectively use adequate emission controls as such that we could, if it was in a larger centralized facility will be easier to move in air strippers and capture of emissions and combustors to destroy those emissions. So it may be easier for the industry to improve air emissions if it is a centralized facility versus a temporary facility. So that's one thing to consider. I completely agree with the enhanced communication with the communities to let them know. Obviously, we've heard from several of the public today, as well as representatives of those groups, that there is a lot of concern from the public regarding the facilities, regarding things such as truck traffic and emissions and all that. Industry needs to listen to those concerns. And likewise, industry needs to be able to quantify and present the benefits of a centralized facility, whether it be X number of truck miles a year that are going to be removed from the local roads with the centralized facility, or if it is going to be the enhanced emission protection that such a facility might bring to the area. So just wanted to put that out there as well.
I thank you for that, Rick, and it kind of goes along with what Chair Messner said. Are you advocating for a section that kind of looks at this topic? I was going to call it something about unintended consequences, but are you advocating for a section to be added, or just for the discussion to consider?
So I would like for the discussion to consider it moving forward. One of the things that, you know, the prohibition, I believe, was effectively put in place in an effort to protect DI communities. But what we need to consider is, again, unintended consequences. Could we do a better job of protecting that community with a centralized facility versus without one?
Okay, thank you. Next is Carmia, and Magdalena, you're after Carmia.
Good morning, Carmia Woolley with the Bureau of Land Management. I agree with Chair Messner and Rick that we might be assuming that we're providing more protections to human health and the environment if we have this blanket prohibition. Yeah, as far as stating it and really trying to, I guess, process that concept, right? When I think about disproportionately impacted communities, you know, we've had the conversation about densely populated areas. So that's more representative of the DJ Basin. But when we talk about the Western Slope, it's counties, right? Where folks are more dispersed, more rural, and it's not densely populated. But obviously there are factors, variables that are considered to identify those communities as disproportionately impacted. So taking a step back, right, I feel like our main focus is to be protective of human health and the environment. That is what I'm hearing from the public. That is what I'm hearing from other consortium members, and really focusing on sensitive receptors. So yes, we can absolutely think about you know, the ozone non-attainment areas. We can also think about other areas. If we are trying to accomplish goals that may at times conflict, right, we have to think outside the box. If we're going to increase reuse, recycling of produced water, right, while also protecting communities, just like Rick was saying, we have to balance those risks. What is most protective of human health and the environment? Because if there's just a blanket prohibition, there will absolutely be unintended consequences where there's greater risk in certain areas to human health and the environment because of that. So really focusing on the sensitive receptors, you know, if we're talking about, for instance, the Western Slope, where we're thinking about right, permitting a centralized produced water treatment facility, with those enhanced protections, right, we would be identifying sensitive receptors, whether that be environmental or humans, right? Where are residents residing? How close is that? Based on science, based on data, and modeling, what are the potential impacts? And looking at the combined cumulative effects on a case-by-case basis. And then one more thought that I wanted to share is that I have been to existing centralized produced water treatment facilities that are near residents. And I do believe that I have heard folks speak, submit their public comments from those areas, and those areas have those existing facilities. If we are going to move forward and permit future facilities, what can we do to minimize those impacts? Like Rick was saying, or even Chair Messner, if we're going to continue to have oil and gas development, right, in some areas of the state, how do we minimize the overall impacts? So just thinking outside the box, right? Existing infrastructure and existing facilities may not be the most protective, but if we're moving forward, what would be? Thank you.
Thank you, Carmia. And I think what I'm hearing from you is to capture some of the broader scope in the new section on legislative intent versus the ECMC request. Does that sound appropriate? Okay, I have Michelina next, and then Michael.
And this is Michelina Pollock with an industry seat. Carmia, your headphones are super crackly. Just FYI. So maybe plug them in tighter or something, because I wanted to hear what you said and it was too crackly. So I was hoping someone else would say it like during your spiel. But Chair Messner, I want to echo what you said. I've spent, I feel like, 2 years trying to articulate what you did in about 3 minutes. And I understand that there is a lot of frustration. And I think a part of it is what Chair Messner was alluding to, right? So we're working with a bill that might have not had the substantive data for us to work through. And in growing through these last couple of years, I think it's been imperative. And I think a lot of expertise in education has been elevated because of the consortium. So I'd like to advocate for bills going forward that a consortium has always started. And then next is a shout out for this regulatory review that was discussed in July that was brought up. I think it pinpoints exactly what Chair Messer was saying, is that, and I went through the cumulative impact rulemaking. So that's why I'm like, wait a minute, there's already things in place here. And I'm on the permitting side, right? So I get to read Rule 909 all the time because I happen to love pits. So, I'm understanding that there are CDPHE and the ECMC rules that are already in place that are extremely protective, and also mitigate, other developmental factors. So I really want us, if we haven't already, to really dive into this regulatory review. I was thankful that especially with 2 different agencies, I think it'll be even more enlightening if federal, BLM, all of these kind of come into place. And then having this model, this regulatory review model, used in other consortium or rulemaking or legislation. So, but I do want to appreciate, Chair Messner, what you said. Like I said, for 2 years, I'm like, nailed it, for me and my perspective. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelina. And of course, to consortium members and members of the public, I might be a little biased, but I agree that the consortium is a great place to work out these bigger questions that regulatory agencies in the legislature struggle with. And then, of course, I want to thank you, Michelina, and the rest of the consortium for recommending this regulatory review. This is in the report document as appendices, and it is quite comprehensive, looking at the regulatory landscape, the different definitions that are used by different regulatory agencies, and really the different approaches that you know are coordinated and sometimes not as coordinated as we'd like. So I thought that was a really good place to start. So I appreciate that, Michelina. Michael, you're next.
Thanks. So, Mike Freeman with one of the conservation NGOs. I have to confess, I'm really torn about this recommendation. I think we've heard a lot of compelling arguments from public commenters and members of this consortium in favor of maintaining the current prohibition, or at least deciding that the science and the information is not there yet to recommend that we eliminate it. On the flip side, though, is I think a lot of folks, including Chair Mesner, made a lot of good arguments for why maybe the statutory prohibition is not always the most protective approach, and that it may have some significant unintended consequences. So I'm frankly struggling with this one. What I do want to say, though, that is important to me is, it may be that the statutory prohibition isn't always the most protective approach, but I also think if we are going to think about moving off of that, we need to be as sure and as certain as possible that what follows it, or what we're recommending to replace it, actually will be as protective or even more protective. And I think from my own experience, I have a lot of concerns with whether that will actually turn out to be the case. And when I look at what's in the current recommendation letter right now, and I think there's a lot of good measures in terms of pipelines, air emissions, better public engagement. All of that are worthwhile steps. But the key question here, the nut of the whole problem, is what kind of proximity-based protections are we going to recommend in its place? The DIC prohibition is a proximity-based measure, and so we need to look at what are we recommending that would replace that. And I have concerns with offering a vague recommendation to just do something that is a good setback, better setback, that either even discourages new development in those areas. Because, I've like a lot of folks on this consortium, I've been through ECMC rulemakings. I was part of the cumulative impacts rulemaking, the mission change rulemaking, a whole variety of other ones. And to be really honest, the ECMC does not have a good track record of maintaining and enforcing setbacks and proximity-based protections. So for me, that's really what I'm grappling with, is how can we make a recommendation that minimizes the risk that whatever comes in place of a statutory prohibition won't be an ineffective, under-enforced measure to protect homes and communities in practice. And I think we all have, I think, a vision of what might follow and how it could be effective, but I also think we need to be conscious of how this would ultimately play out when it gets to the rulemaking, the legislature, and the implementation. And so where I go with that is, I would just ask is that if we are going to propose, and I really take Chair Mesner's point that there'd be a lot of value in trying to reach consensus here, and that if we want to have an impact on what comes out, we'll be better off if we can speak with one voice. So what I would ask from all of that is, whatever we recommend, if we recommend a change, that we provide, at least for context, some specifics about what we are thinking about in terms of a setback. And I don't expect that we're going to reach consensus on what a distance is or what that looks like. I understand that. That's a much longer discussion, and one I think will have to happen at ECMC and probably the legislature. But I would hope, other folks have raised a number of issues that they think are important perspectives to include in the recommendation for context. And I would just ask that, one of those perspectives and points mention that, at least some commissioners or some consortium members rather, feel that it's important that if we go to a setback approach, it be modeled after the current Rule 907, which does not have exceptions to it. And that we at least say that some consortium members feel that a setback on the order of 4 to 5 miles or multiple miles would be reasonable and appropriate. And I'm absolutely not suggesting that we try to reach consensus or recommend those. I'm just asking that whatever we have in this report include that perspective so that when the commission and the legislature look at this, they understand where at least some of us are, what this discussion involved and what some of the issues were when it came to considering a setback or a proximity-based strategy. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I think what I'm hearing is if we add a section that is talking about legislative intent versus the ECMC request, we also include that any protections are as protective as the current rules, but actually more protective. And the current rules include the complete prohibition, but are as protective or more protective.
That's helpful, but again, I'm really.
I have a second.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
So that's the first, and I'm glad that I'm capturing it correctly. The second one is really for people to think about. We do have like 32 minutes left for this discussion, so I'm sure that more will be discussed about this, but to potentially look at for the proximity. So we have proximity and site selection. I think we have general agreement on the storage and emissions control, transportation, pipeline infrastructure, enhanced community engagement and coordination with federal, state, and local governments. But this proximity and site selection, I actually think we have agreement on the site selection part of that. But the proximity, we could potentially either add sentences about different points of view, or we could potentially say, we need more time to really look at this proximity, and we ask the commission to come back to the consortium to really dive deep into that proximity protective. So that's what I want to throw out. We still have a lot of panelists to get to. Does that sound okay as far as just discussion?
Sure, let's hear what other people think.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We have Mark, and then Irene will be after Mark.
Hey, thanks, Hope. Mark Hefta, representing the industry in the DJ Basin. Again, first, I'd like to just thank Hope and the whole consortium staff for all the work. I know it's been a tough couple of weeks, so I do appreciate all the work you guys have been doing and all the communications you've been putting out. And then I do want to echo, again, thanks for Chairman Mesner's comments. They're said way better than I could on unintended consequences. And then also, I do want to support Barbara on the DIC in the non-attainment areas. I think from what we saw from the EnviroScreen 1.0 to the 2.0, there's, in my opinion, pretty significant changes. And as we're starting to develop plans to hit the 10% and higher recycling rates, having some certainty on where we can actually locate a facility is going to be critical, right? I think one of the big unintended consequences on top of trucking is I think we're going to use less if there's prohibitions in non-attainment areas and DIC non-attainment areas. I think that's going to end up significantly reducing the amount of produced water recycle we can perform. And yeah, again, a lot of talk, great discussions here. I just clearly want to just say we really should focus on, I know we don't have the data now, but getting additional data on what the actual emissions are from this treated recycling and treated produced water. I think that's going to give us a lot of information in the future to set any kind of a setback type discussions, and just using actual science-based evaluations to look at cumulative impacts, and then also engage in the community. I think that's very critical. But I generally support going in a direction that does not set a general restriction. I think that's going to have a lot of negative impacts going forward. But thank you.
I have one question, Mark. Are you okay with the way that the proximity section is written now with the bright line setbacks, or is that something?
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Yeah, I do want to, and I think it's discussed in the main body of the recommendation, is that it will be based on actual evaluations and studies of the actual emissions, right? And I think that's in that. I think that's in there. So I'm okay with that statement there.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Irene?
Yep.
Hi, Irene Andrus. I want to thank everybody, including the guest speakers, for really great input. And it's been a lot to think about and process, and especially everything you just said, Commissioner Messner. A lot of people are talking about how we don't have really the data to make this decision. We currently have facilities, and it would be really good to know, and Mark, you just alluded to this, what exactly are the issues? And then we could look into addressing how do we mitigate these issues. And then once we know what are solutions that actually solve the issues, then we can put those into the recommendations. So it would be good to test out how can we mitigate issues on existing places where there are open pits, or and find how can we solve these? And once we know how to solve them, incorporate that information into what we're suggesting. But right now, it seems premature. We just don't have the data. And I agree with everything that you've captured so far, Hope. If we can maybe somehow get in there about implementing solutions and determine what's effective. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've commented at all on implementation. I think from my perspective, we weren't asked to comment on implementation, but I think this is great for the additional considerations. So if you're okay with that, I would add it to the additional considerations. Okay, from your nodding, I'm going to say that you're okay with that. Let's see, Carmia.
Carmia Woolley with the Bureau of Land Management. Hopefully you can hear me.
Much better.
Okay, better bandwidth at this moment. Okay, let me know if it reduces. So speaking to the proximity, I think it would be great to be informed by AQCD with the CDPHE. So lots of acronyms. I feel like I'm rapping right now. But air resource specialists on near field modeling, and perhaps even the EPA has specialists to speak to near field modeling, far field modeling on emissions surrounding facilities, whether it be pits or centralized produced water treatment facilities, or even researchers, to know what proximity considerations we should review. My other thought, though, is when it comes to centralized produced water treatment facilities, there are so many factors to consider on a case-by-case basis. For instance, what are the emissions? If everything's enclosed, if emissions are captured, then that's very different from open-top tanks that with partial treatment of water. right? Completely different. And then also, you know, when you're talking about transportation, what if there are lots of roads in nearby? If it's densely disturbed, if there's residents, right? If there's sensitive wildlife areas, right? And then also water is a huge one too. There's just so many factors that go into it, which is why I think it would be great to hear from air resource specialists on data, on things that are known, on identifying gaps, but then also to consider other potential impacts with that cumulative analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmia. What I'm hearing is recognizing that the consortium really hasn't done a deep dive into air quality emissions. And I briefly mentioned in the recommendations that ECMC has an air quality working group that would inform the consortium's work. So I can maybe highlight that or just ensure that we have already captured your thoughts. Is that good? Okay. Chair Messner.
Thanks, Hope. Just a couple of thoughts to hopefully move us forward here a little bit. Really appreciate Mike's perspective and his thoughts. I think it does make sense in my opinion, in the enhanced protections section to identify that there are some consortium members that think a magnitude of miles is an appropriate setback, and that I don't know if I want to see us utilizing a specific rule, but one of the questions I have, I think in there, and I'm not looking at it right now, it does talk about that those significant bright line setbacks would not include exceptions. I think, is it in there? If it's not in there, I would agree that it should have the same. I think it's okay for us to be even specific as to say that, you know, informed consent would be, you know, the only allowance for variation from those setbacks. I'm not sure if it says that in there or not. I understand what Mike's trying to say, and I think that makes sense, is that we don't want, you know, 15 different waivers from the setback standards associated with this, but rather really mirror what is existing in rules. It does say that we apply the existing rules in there, and so maybe that does it in and of itself, because it says we're applying the existing rules plus these enhanced standards, and so maybe that does it. I don't know. But anyway, I just want to acknowledge that I support that. And that was my assumption of what we were saying anyway, is that informed consent was the only allowance for variation from that setback. I also appreciate Mike's kind of where he is, I think, and I don't want to speak for you, Mike, so tell me if I'm not right here, but that you're acknowledging that there is this instance in our recommendation where even in disproportionately impacted communities in the ozone non-attainment area, that there could be an allowance for siting inside if there was a showing that siting it outside would be more impactful than siting it inside. But that my understanding, my assumption there is that all the enhanced protections that we're talking about for the rest of the state would then apply there as well. I think if it's not clear, then we should call that out as well, that those enhanced protections for the rest of the state would apply in those in those very rare and unique circumstances. And I think the only other thing I've got was, you know, we say discourage or disallow in densely populated areas. I would like to emphasize that we're really trying to not allow these to happen in densely populated areas, but I also don't want to get too explicit there, because there's no defined term for this densely populated area, and so I don't want to get in that fight. And so I would almost suggest that we say, discourage or disallow in densely populated areas with an emphasis on disallow, right? So, or something like that. But those are just my thoughts. With the goal of moving us forward here, if this is the path that we ultimately are looking at going towards. So,
I hope I don't want to jump the line, but mind if I just respond a little bit quickly? Great, thanks. Chair Measure, I know I agree with all that. I mean, I think the point you made about allowing rare exceptions for facilities in the non-attainment area. I think if we do that, it would definitely make sense to have the enhanced protections as a backstop there. So that would be great to clarify. And in terms of you're referring specifically to 907 as I did, I think we're saying the same thing, which is the idea that a setback could allow for an exception where there's consent of the resident, but that would be the only significant exception, which is consistent with the current Rule 907, but we could say it in a different way if that's more comfortable for sure. So thank you.
That's great. And in the chat, I have put, staff has put the full application of current rules regarding cumulative impacts in DI communities and the increased and bright line setbacks. And it does say larger, so we would update the larger setbacks to the language that Mike has provided, and then we would add to the first alternative about non-attainment areas some kind of clear identification that the second alternative applies even in those areas.
Yeah. And I think Chair Measures' point too, that I think he suggested somewhere we say, some members thought a setback in the order of miles would be appropriate too. I think that would be useful to include somewhere here too.
Thank you. I also wrote that down and didn't repeat it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara?
Yeah, two things. One, after this conversation between John and Mike, I suggest that Mike be involved with you in polishing that section so that we capture the language that he intends. But the second is, I'd
Before
really
you
like
go
to
on,
see
Barbara, I missed it. You said work with somebody. Did you say work with Mike?
Mike.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
I did. Yeah. Sorry if I wasn't clear. The second is, all of us have struggled with this. It's not sexy to be the one recommending penetration of this DIC protection. We understand as we dig into the details, a lot of which the public may not be aware of, is that maybe the protection isn't as great as we had originally thought. So in the preamble, in the letter to Julie, I think it's really important that we set out that we were asked to engage in this thought experiment on if the DIC prohibition is removed by legislation, what would be the recommendation for protecting the population in DICs for centralized produced water and treatment and storage facilities, something like that, because it really underscores the struggle we're all having. It feels like such a comprehensive protection when you say you can't do it in DICs, and yet there are other types of facilities, as well as the time variable of where the boundaries of DICs are makes that prohibition much more like Swiss cheese than an umbrella.
That's quite the visual. And I think this concept of engaging in a thought experiment will go well with this section that's already been requested of legislative intent versus the ECMC request to include a discussion on the unintended consequences. So I will work with you to incorporate that engagement of thought experiment.
Yeah. And in addition, recognizing upfront in that preamble that so much of the data we need to make a data-informed recommendation is missing, and therefore take our recommendation in that spirit, right? That we have much more work to do, and we invite you to come back to us at a later date for further refinement of our recommendation, something like that.
I appreciate, and again, I'm biased, but I appreciate coming back for further work by the consortium. Next up is Jesse and then Harmony.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jesse Newland. I'm with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, Region 8 in Denver. I work in the Waste Division. I appreciate Mr. Ramash and Miss Irene's comments on the need for more data. That's something that, we do need. And if we are going to recommend changes, then we need to fully understand what it's going to take to be able to achieve the protectiveness that we are trying to get. My experience in government is one size fits all regulations often cause problems. And so there needs to be a kind of an off ramp. And I guess a quick example would be a DIC community. We ban those facilities completely from being there, but then one gets built right on the border of the DIC community, and say it's upwind of the facility, and there's minimal air controls, air emission controls. That was essentially negate the whole point of the ban, is that all those emissions would be blowing into the DIC community anyway. And so siting, engineer controls, and infrastructure are, to me, really important to make this all work. I see there's going to be a need for a large investment into infrastructure. I see that with probably industry and some government involvement as well. But saying things like build a pipeline and do all these things are not things that happen overnight. It takes a lot of work. They got to get permission to cross all these property boundaries, et cetera. So it takes a long time. And then the other thing I would like to add is that it varies greatly from state to state how oil and gas waste is managed. Now, I understand that we don't hear the term waste used much, but produced water is a solid waste until it's recycled. Right. Once it's been determined that it can be recycled and reused, then, it's outside of that. But the way that waste is managed, you can tell drastically when you travel to different oil fields about how the regulations apply and how they operate. Some fields are almost totally enclosed with tank systems and pipelines. Others are almost the complete opposite, and everything is trucked. There's zero pipelines. And so the amount of infrastructure is going to take to get to the point where we can ensure the engineering controls are protective is, one, a lot of money, and two, it's going to take a lot of time. And so from my view, the protection principle has been brought up a few times. The protection principle, that would ensure that industry would have all this figured out before a facility would be built, right? So in order to show protection, you need to show what engineering controls are going to be, what kind of mitigations for half of those engineering controls fail, et cetera. And then finally, I work under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and I just wanted to say, because I haven't had a chance to kind of give this little spiel, but basically RCRA is the abbreviation or the acronym for the Resource Conservation Recovery Act that manages all things waste, regulates all things waste. But we push for reuse. That's one of the main tenets of the RCRA statute, is that we try to reuse waste where we can for some sort of beneficial use. And that's kind of where we're at in this whole kind of process, is determining, is it better or not to be able to recycle this water? Where do we put this recycled water? I mean, the emissions I see are probably one of the bigger challenges. I mean, surface impoundments leak, so there's always a possibility for pipelines to burst or impoundments to leak. But to me, one of the larger threats from this is the control of the emissions. And so I see that as an engineering issue. But again, appreciate the time, and yeah, look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. And Thank you for sending that information about RCRA. It was included in the report. And thank you for sharing those examples. Harmony and then Rick.
Harmony Cummings and Environmental C, and I have two separate points. I think as we're having this conversation, we also need to push that there's been great advances in removing hydrocarbons and emissions with pressure plate separators, and advances in mobile treatment technology that are happening today. There's also been increased storage capacity with modular large volume tanks, like a giant metal pot with a camelback bladder in it that moves. I think it's really important so that we look at these things, that this, again, the centralized facility is not our only option. The oil and gas industry has some of the best engineers and unlimited pockets to do incredible things. And I highlight that again here. Number two is I attended 2 meetings this week with APCD, one specifically on produced water emissions and the other on air toxics, in which 80% of the air toxics are attributed to oil and gas. They highlighted that their biggest struggle is the lack of funding and staff to thoroughly do their work. We continue to not have the data we need, and a community member right now is texting me for a definition of community engagement. What does this really mean, and how can we do this? All of these things need funding, and the only way I am comfortable with changing this prohibition is if we also look at a way to get the funding that we need to improve our data, our education, our storyboard that's almost finished but doesn't have enough to actually get out to the public here in the Produced Water Consortium, to have more meetings, to better explore better protections for public health, environment, wildlife, and communities, in-field research projects, data verification, data systems improvements, including modeling, monitoring, OGI cameras, and flyovers that we heard from the industry, which is an incredible tool for them. Let's have that for us here. In addition, I think it's important that we have funding for additional inspectors as we continue to talk about the impacts that all of this has onto our communities, and funding for EJ, DIC, and impacted community grants for community-based research, outreach, monitoring, and education and advocacy coming from the community grass up instead of always from us down to them. And so for me to feel comfortable here today, I think that that is something that we need to include in these recommendations as the shortfalls that we feel that we've explored and have come to light through this process.
Yeah, Harmony, what I'm hearing is to add some examples to under the transportation and pipeline infrastructure. We have advanced technology and innovation, and some of the examples you shared, I will get with you to get those incorporated into that section, and then to add a consideration, an additional consideration regarding funding. Does that capture it?
Yes, and just also I want to echo other people's, what a tremendous task this has been for you, Hope, and what a great job you have done this is its first of its kind of this kind of analysis on regulations, and so much gratitude because this is not easy.
I appreciate that. I have Rick and then Carmia, and we probably need to go back to Chair Messner as we're getting close to time. So Rick?
All right, thank you, Director Dalton. And just briefly, following up on the comments of Jesse and Barbara and Director Dalton and Chair Messner, and I also agree with the current language around the bright line setbacks, and I also agree with the comments being made that we have a lack of comprehensive air quality data. Right, so for the time being now, we need to take that into consideration when we're talking about setbacks. But ultimately, I do believe setbacks need to be science-based. And therefore, I agree with the comments about possibly sending a note back to ECMC saying that the consortium would like some additional time to consider the topic of setbacks to see if we can make it some sort of science-based recommendation. If industry was willing to come in and agree to comprehensive air quality monitoring and reporting for a facility and agree to meet stringent air quality emission goals, then I think that should be taken into consideration when we're talking about setbacks for that facility versus one that doesn't necessarily meet those comprehensive goals, right? Or those enhanced goals. So I just want to, and one of the reasons I say that is when we're looking at these large diameter pipelines, typically you're looking at $1 to $2 million a mile to put those in. Therefore, if we had a little bit shorter distance to put a pipeline in, that allows for more money going to making these facilities much more acceptable to the community and much more with greater emissions controls. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll include this in my summary at the end of the meeting. Carmia?
Carmia Woolley, Bureau of Land Management. Really enjoyed the discussion today. I'm just going to plant a seed right now. This has been great. Hope and Aaron, thank you for all of your work. I do feel like I feel confident in what everybody's discussed and shared today, but I'm really looking forward to more of like the community engagement component and hearing more details from the public, right, about what their concerns are with the existing facilities or past facilities, right? That is one of our main goals. And with that, I am going to hand it over to maybe Chair Messner.
Thanks, Carmia, and thank you everyone for thoughts today. And I mean, good discussion, good openness, good critical thinking. Really appreciate the work today. I think we provided some direction to Hope and some cleanup of the draft. But I think Hope this is probably the point where we want to make sure that people feel like their voices are captured, whether they're comfortable with the recommendation, with the changes that were discussed today. Also keeping in mind and understanding that, like I've said a bunch today already, but this is an opportunity to guide and lay the framework for, ultimately whoever becomes the decision makers. And I know that many individuals on the consortium here will continue to engage actively, with whatever the next processes are in the decision-making process. And so I do know that and would expect that. And I think that that's a good thing. And so, are we comfortable with this, where the voices are, where we've landed, with the recommendation, with the changes that have been expressed to Hope through the course of the meeting today? Is there anyone that has heartburn, I guess? I mean, I always have heartburn, but that's why I take Prilosec. But
I think what you're asking, Chair Messner, is there anybody who is uncomfortable with the letter as drafted with the revisions we discussed, right? It's easier than having people say they're for it. Is there anybody who's against it?
That's correct.
I just do have one question, Hope. Will you be able to circulate the final draft with these changes around before it goes out, or?
Well, I'm running on a very tight deadline. And so will it be circulated? Yes, but I'm not going to make any changes based on, well, unless it's egregious, but it's not up for negotiation after today.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think within reason, right? I mean, if it's clear, I mean, you've gotten certain direction to talk to certain people and make sure that that perspective is captured. And I think that's what Hope has always done. And so to her credit, I think that'll be important. I also think it's important, Hope, that you take the time that you need without, overburdening yourself to get the recommendation in. This will be our last meeting on this topic for the foreseeable future. And we have a deadline of September 1st to provide it to ECMC. But I will unilaterally give you permission to take a couple extra days or whatever you need in order to get this done. So if we get it in on September 3rd or 4th, it's not going to be the end of the world. And so do understand that.
Thank you, Chair Messner, and I hope that the other commissioners agree with a little bit of an extension, and I appreciate that, Grace.
Well, with that, closing thoughts, Hope.
I thank everyone and for this really great and robust conversation. I'm glad that so many different members spoke up today. I will be adding a section on legislative intent versus the ECMC request. I'll be adding a section on public comment, incorporating what we've learned from the key themes. I'll be adding to the section on the legislative intent versus ECMC request, really a discussion on unintended consequences and really looking at the blanket prohibitions, protectiveness of the blanket prohibition. I'll be revisiting the proximity discussion and definitely revising that language, larger setbacks, and then adding to that section, some members are suggesting a magnitude of miles. I'll be working with Mike on that. And then I'll also be adding some members are requesting additional time to investigate the data and the setbacks. And there are several members that I could work with on that. And then I'll be adding examples to the tech and innovation bullet, and I'll be working with Harmony on that. And then additional considerations, I'll be working with Irene on implementation and on funding with Harmony. And with that, thank you all.
Have a great Labor Day weekend. Thank you everyone for your work. Really appreciate it, for embracing the idea of a consortium, and really do appreciate it. So yeah, we'll catch you guys at the next meeting, whenever that may be.
Thank you.